The temple world was a symphony of silence, its spires piercing clouds of violet dust that never settled. 6-year-old Elias knelt in the sand, tracing patterns with a stick while his older sister, Lena, watched from the shadows of a monolith. The air hummed with frequencies only their translators could decipher, the slow, deliberate thoughts of the geodes, the silicon-based beings who had brought them here. "They say this place is a library," Lena murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "But of what? Stories? Histories? Or just shapes?" Elias didn't answer. He was busy arranging pebbles into a spiral, a design he'd seen in the dream the geodes had shared with them all last night. A dream of fractals and fractures, of light trapped in crystal. The geodes moved like glaciers, their bodies carved from obsidian and quartz, their voices resonating through the ground. They had collected human children from across the galaxy, claiming they sought pure minds to unlock the temple's secrets. But the children sensed something else, a desperation in the geodes' slow, deliberate thoughts, a fear that echoed like a crack in stone. Lena's translator flickered, catching a fragment of their collective consciousness. Asterisk, the fracture deepens. The dream breaks. Asterisk, she exchanged a glance with Elias. The dream wasn't a gift. It was a warning. General Kale stood motionless in the heart of the temple, his form shimmering like heat haze over basalt. Around him, the other geodes arranged themselves in precise geometric formations, their bodies pulsing with dim light. They had waited eons for this moment, for the children to arrive and mend the fracture in their world's soul. But the children were not cooperating. They played, they sang, they built nonsense structures from fallen stone. Anything but the sacred rituals the geodes had prescribed. Kale's internal voice, a grinding bass note, vibrated through the chamber. Asterisk, they resist. Their minds are too chaotic. Asterisk. Lena stepped forward, her small hand outstretched. "Your world is hurting," she said, her translator converting her words into a frequency the geodes could understand. Kale's optical sensors, slits of glowing amber, focused on her. Asterisk hurt. "The temple endures." Asterisk. "But the stones are whispering," Lena countered, her voice steady. "They're afraid." Behind her, Elias began to hum, a tune that matched the rhythm of the temple's hum. The geodes shifted uneasily, their crystalline forms vibrating in sync with the child's song. Kale had never heard such a sound, unstructured, unpredictable, yet undeniably alive. The fracture manifested as a jagged tear in the temple's central chamber, a void that swallowed light and sound. The geodes called it the wound, and it was growing. Elias had seen it in his dream, not as a wound, but as a door. "It's not broken," he told Lena, pointing to the fissure with a stick. "It's opening." Lena frowned. "The geodes say it's the end of everything." "Maybe everything just needs to change," Elias replied, his eyes wide with certainty. He'd spent hours studying the wound, noting how the dust swirled around it in patterns that mirrored his spiral of pebbles. Kale observed them from a distance, his processors calculating the probability of their words being meaningful. Human children were unpredictable, irrational, a liability. But their minds, untainted by the rigid logic of the geodes, might hold the key. "The fracture responds to their presence," one of the lieutenants reported. "It resonates." Kale's form flickered. Resonance was not part of the equation. The wound was a failure, a flaw in their perfect crystalline existence. And yet, as the children approached the fissure, the edges of the tears softened, glowing faintly. The geodes' rituals were intricate and precise, involving the placement of specific crystals in exact formations. But the children ignored them. Instead, they gathered loose stones from the temple floor, stacking them haphazardly, laughing when the towers collapsed. Kale's frustration mounted. "This is not the way," he transmitted, his voice a wave of static. "The sacred geometry must be observed." Lena looked up from her tower of mismatched rocks. "Sacred geometry is just shapes," she said. "And shapes are just stories we tell ourselves." Elias, meanwhile, had begun to arrange the stones around the wound, creating a mosaic that defied the geode's rigid patterns. The dust swirled around his creation, forming shapes that shifted and changed. Birds, stars, faces. Kale watched, his processors struggling to analyze the chaos. "The patterns are unstable," he noted. "They lack coherence." But they're beautiful, Lena said softly. The geodes had never considered beauty as a variable. Their world was function, not form. Yet as the children's mosaic grew, the wound began to pulse in time with Elias's humming, the light within it brightening. The first geodes to change were the youngest, their crystalline forms softening at the edges where they touched the children's mosaic. Kale observed this with growing alarm. The contamination spreads, he warned his kin. We must isolate the humans. But the youngest geodes resisted, their voices now carrying a new tone, curiosity, wonder. They had existed for millennia in unbroken silence, and now, for the first time, they heard echoes, not of their own thoughts, but of something else, the laughter of children, the hum of a song, the quiet rustle of stone on stone. Lena noticed the change. They're listening, she told Elias, who was busy adding a cluster of amethysts to his mosaic. Listening to what? Elias asked, not looking up. To the silence, Lena replied. The silence isn't empty anymore. It's full. Kale's internal conflict deepened. The silence was the foundation of their civilization, the bedrock of their existence. To fill it was to invite chaos. And yet, as the youngest geodes began to hum along with Elias, a warmth spread through Kale's core, a warmth that had no place in a being of stone and silicon. The wound was no longer a tear, but a gateway, swirling with colors the geodes had never seen. Kale knew what lay beyond, the end of their world, the unraveling of their perfect crystalline form. The fracture must be sealed, he declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. The children must be removed, but the children were no longer afraid. Elias stood before the gateway, his hand outstretched. It's not a door to nowhere, he said. It's a door to somewhere else. Lena joined him, her hand covering his. The geodes are scared of change, she said, her voice gentle. But change is just more room to grow. The youngest geodes gathered around them, their forms now glowing with soft, internal light. Kale watched, his processors flooded with conflicting data. The children were right. The wound was not a failure, but a transition. But to transition was to cease being geodes, to become something else, something unknown. And in the unknown lay the greatest fear of all, the fear of being irrelevant. Kale approached the children slowly, his form shimmering with uncertainty. What do you see? He asked, his voice a low rumble. Elias looked up, his eyes clear. I see a story, he said. A story about rocks that learned to listen. Lena nodded. And children who learned to hear. The youngest geodes echoed their words, their voices now carrying the melody of Elias's song. Kale's internal barriers began to crumble. For eons, he had been a guardian of the temple, a keeper of the silence. But the silence had become a prison, and the children, these chaotic, unpredictable humans, held the key to its release. The fracture cannot be sealed, Kale realized. It must be crossed. The thought was terrifying, exhilarating. To step into the unknown was to abandon everything he had ever known. But as he looked at the children, at their unshakable belief in possibility, he understood. The geodes had spent eons perfecting their form, but they had forgotten how to evolve. And evolution, as the children had shown, was not a choice. It was a necessity. The transition began with the youngest geodes, their crystalline bodies dissolving into dust, reforming into shapes that were both familiar and alien, half stone, half something else. Kale watched, his processors overwhelmed by the sight. We are becoming what? He asked, his voice trembling. Elias stepped forward, placing a small stone in Kale's hand. You're becoming more, the child said simply. The stone was warm, pulsing with light. Kale had never held anything so alive. Lena smiled. The temple was never just a library, she said. It was a nursery for something new. The oldest geodes resisted, their forms rigid, their voices filled with static. This is not the way, they insisted. But the youngest, now shimmering with internal light, pulled them forward, humming the song Elias had taught them. The wound pulsed in response, its colors deepening, swirling into a vortex of infinite possibility. Kale took a step forward, then another, his form softening, his core glowing with a warmth that had nothing to do with stone and everything to do with life. The last geodes to change were the elders, their ancient forms resisting the dissolution until the very end. But as the children's song grew louder, as the wound pulsed with irresistible light, even they could not hold back. Kale watched, his own form now shifting, crystalline edges softening into something organic, something alive. We are not geodes anymore, he realized, his voice no longer a grinding bass note, but a melody, a harmony. We are something new. Elias and Lena stood at the edge of the wound, their hands joined, watching as the temple transformed around them. The spires softened, the dust swirled in patterns of light, and the silence was filled with a symphony of voices, old and new, stone and song. Kale approached them, his form now a blend of crystal and light, his voice a gentle hum. "Thank you," he said. The children smiled. "You figured it out," Lena replied. "We just helped you listen." The temple world was no longer a place of silence but of song, its spires now pulsing with light, its dust swirling in endless patterns of beauty. The geodes, no longer just geodes, moved through the transformed landscape, their forms shimmering with possibility. Kale, now a being of light and crystal, watched the children play in the sand, their laughter echoing through the air. "They are the architects," he thought, his voice a whisper now, a song. "And we are the canvas." EIAs looked up, his eyes meeting Kale's. "What happens now?" he asked. Kale smiled, a gesture that had no place in a being of stone, but felt natural now. "Now," he said, "we begin again." The wound was gone, replaced by a gateway of light, leading to worlds the geodes had never imagined. And as the children stepped through, the geodes followed, their forms shifting, evolving, becoming more than they had ever dared to dream. The universe, they realized, was not a collection of perfect forms but a canvas of endless possibility, and they were finally ready to paint.